Good afternoon. Welcome. Hello, I'm Mike Solomon. I'm Dean of the Graduate School, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's event. I would like to, this is our keynote event, and we've kind of had a multi-part day, and I'll be introducing our keynote speaker, Renée DiResta, in just a moment. Professor DiResta is the keynote speaker as part of Rackham's Gupta Professional Ethics Series. This series is designed to encourage interdisciplinary conversations about ethics among UM students and the UM community as they prepare to create positive change in their fields and the world. The University of Michigan is created to fostering the highest ethical standards in the conduct of its research, teaching, and scholarship, and professional ethics are critical for our graduates in the increasingly diverse career paths that they pursue. This series, therefore, aligns with those values of both Rackham and the university that we seek to embody and instill. I think it contributes meaningfully to how we can support students in developing the skills to be successful at Michigan and beyond. This series was made possible by a gift from the Gupta Family Foundation. Shashi and Margaret Gupta from the foundation are here today, so please join me in welcoming and thanking them. Margaret is a Rackham alum, and the Guptas have been longstanding supporters of the graduate school, where they have also established the Gupta Values Scholarship Fund. I'm extremely grateful for their support in advancing ethics, integrity, and excellence on our campus at the University of Michigan. I also want to acknowledge all the Rackham staff members, many of who you've seen, especially Laura Schramm and Danielle Coleman, who played a role in shaping this year's event. And I'd also like to give a special big thank you to our partners at the Ford School of Public Policy, who have been instrumental in planning this event. My thanks to Dean Celeste Walken-Hayes, Professor Jennifer Bednar, and Daniel Rifkin for their close collaboration. You will see more of Professor Bednar and Dr. Schramm a little later in our event during the question and answer session. I'm also grateful for the Ford School's partnership in this event because Rackham and the Ford School, I believe, both have deep interest in creating opportunities for public discourse and intellectual exchange. As a public institution, we naturally need to promote such discourse in ways that are nonpartisan and reflect diversity of thought. But those constraints do not mean that we should step back from tough conversations or a strong defense of the value of knowledge, expertise, data, analysis, and debate, as exemplified by today's event and our series. We are fortunate to be joined today by our keynote speaker, Professor Renée DiResta. Professor DiResta studies adversarial abuse online, ranging from state actors running influence operations to those who propagate online scams and to issues related to child safety. The nature of these challenges increasingly intersects with generative AI. She is the author of Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. As she writes, she is interested in exploring not only how problems manifest, but what we can do about them. From 2019 to 2023, Professor DiResta was the Technical Research Manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory, a cross-disciplinary program of research, teaching, and policy engagement for the study of abuse in current information technologies. She has advised Congress, the State Department, and other academic, civic, and business organizations on issues related to technology and policy, including information operations, generative AI, election security, researcher transparency, and more. Professor DiResta is a contributor at The Atlantic. Her byline writing has also appeared in Wired, Foreign Affairs, the Columbia Journalism Review, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Yale Review, Guardian, Political, Slate, and Noema, as well as many academic journals. She has been a Presidential Leadership Scholar, which is a program run by the Presidents Bush and Clinton and the LBJ Foundations, an Emerson Fellow, a Truman National Security Project Fellow, a Mozilla Fellow in Media, Misinformation, and Trust, and a Harvard Berkman Klein affiliate, and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Please join me in welcoming Professor Renée DiResta to the podium for her keynote. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey there, it is great to be here today. All right, hope everybody can hear me. Perfect, it's advancing. All right, so a post appeared on a social media platform a few weeks ago, and I want to use it as an example to kind of couch what we're going to talk about in this talk. How many people are familiar with the image behind me? Have you seen it or are you aware of the story? Okay, so about half. All right, so this ominous warning from a person who seems to be genuinely concerned was shared into a local crime group in Springfield, Ohio on Facebook. But it didn't stay on Facebook, it spread around the internet. So the allegations in the post, let's see, here we go, okay. The allegations in the post made it to Twitter, right? So a few people took the screenshot, posted it to Twitter, and from Twitter, it went wildly viral. This rumor that people were eating pets was picked up by the Trump presidential campaign, specifically by the vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, who is also, it happens, the senator from Ohio. So Mr. Vance is a member of the political elite. He's a man with a massive megaphone. And so when J.D. Vance took this random rumor that had been making the rounds, getting a little bit of pickup in the rumor mill on Twitter, it went massively viral. And as often happens, the public began to participate in the conversation. And one of the ways that this happens is by making memes, right? So they made memes about the situation. Most of the memes came from supporters. And so you see they really run the gamut. Some of them are intended to be humorous and cute. You know, they're the cats and dogs that, cats and ducks in this case that Trump is saving. Some of them, you know, get into the sort of racist imagery, right, of the black people chasing Trump with, who's the savior of these cats. And then the last one is an image that Trump himself shared, provenance unknown, where he has the sort of MAGA cat brigade there. So this is sort of in the tone and style of the internet, gets kind of into the realm of the funny. People like to share this stuff. It's a signifier, like you're a member of the in-group, you think it's funny, it's entertaining. And so this stuff too goes viral, right? And all of these things kind of build upon each other. Things are ping-ponging back and forth between ordinary people, political elites, media begins to cover this, comes back to the ordinary people. And then all of a sudden, I'm very sad that I couldn't play the sound for you today. Show of hands, how many people actually heard the audio here? Good, I'm glad. Because what happens is President Trump expresses this comment, they're eating the pets, out loud on national news on a presidential debate. An image that I did not have time to share for you here is that then you see Google search trends pick up a whole lot of people in Ohio searching the phrase, trying to figure out what on earth he is talking about. Because you have the extremely online conversation, and then you have the people who are not seeing the cat memes wondering what is the former president of the United States talking about. When this makes it to the debate, what happens is the vibes shift, right? Other people then now on the left begin to pick it up. No longer is it something that is like a plaything for the right. What you start to see instead is the pushback. Things like audio. This fellow, he makes a reggae song. It's fantastic, actually. It becomes a source of mockery, a source of ridicule. If you go on TikTok, people make a sound. They're eating the pets, and people begin to do a dance challenge too. They're eating the pets, right? Meanwhile, again, this shift in what's happening online and what's happening offline as ordinary people are trying to figure out what this means creates a little bit of a divide. So hyper-partisan right-wing influencers and media outlets really did not like this vibe shift, right? All of a sudden, they're eating the pets was a source of ridicule as opposed to a statement of a bold truth. And so they reacted by insisting that the rumor had in fact been true. They solicited evidence. Chris Rufo offered a $5,000 bounty. In response, somebody offered up this grainy video that had been on Facebook since 2023, and then this started an entire conversation as people got to work, zooming in to try to figure out what the meat on the grill actually is. So this is one of these scenarios, unfortunately, that doesn't just stay online. It's not something that's a source of ridicule, right? Because while the conversation is ostensibly about this rumor, what the rumor is expressing is a deeper fear and a deeper truth. And a truth in the sense that people feel acutely that there has been some change to their community, and they're using this narrative with these incredibly racist undertones to express it in a way that is appropriate for the internet, but they're eating the cats is actually talking about something else entirely. And it becomes, in a sense, a propaganda narrative in which a rumor is picked up by powerful people, turned into a propagandist campaign, and moved into, unfortunately, the real world. As what starts to happen is bomb threats begin to happen as people begin to pay attention to this, to hear these stories about the purported, pet eaters. An Ohio businessman, a Republican, who had hired a lot of Haitian immigrants onto his team at his business, made a video, did a news segment talking about how valuable they were to the community. And he was rewarded, unfortunately, with death threats for making these statements. He had to get security for his family. Because what happens online isn't staying online, and the intersection of the rumor mill, the propaganda machine, and then the harassment and the actual threats that often accompany a blowback that are actually part and parcel to it has become, unfortunately, a quite normal stage of quite a normal process in which people make sense of the world today or have political conversations today. And I made this deck maybe 3 weeks ago now, and since then I could have used Hurricane Helene, I could have used Hurricane Milton. This happens over and over and over again. And so I want to talk a little bit about what is happening as the kind of first part of this talk. So my book argues that we're living in a time in which two distinct systems for shaping public opinion have collided within one technological ecosystem. So first is the rumor mill, right? Rumors are narratives, often explanations for events in the world that frequently challenge official stories. So they're things that people express amongst themselves. I tell my friend who tells their friend who tells their friend, almost like a game of telephone. They're not misinformation. They often spread before the truth can actually be known. These are two very, very different things. And rumors are interesting because they sometimes do turn out to be true. Sometimes the unofficial narrative is actually true. This is one of the reasons why they're sticky and persistent, because there's never a fully committed sense of resolution. Oftentimes the rumor is expressing something that people feel a deep sense of distrust about. And most importantly, they're participatory, which means that people get very invested in them. And when they're invested, when they're participating in spreading them, they don't often walk back their own opinion. Instead, maybe they'll just kind of stop talking about it. So for all of human history, people have shared stories with each other. And this was largely bounded by geography. When you told your friend who told their friends, that did stay confined to a particular space. But as we saw in the case of Springfield, Ohio, you maybe think you're talking to your friends in the local Facebook group, but all of a sudden this becomes blown out of proportion and it becomes a matter of national attention. And one of the interesting things that happened when media began to cover that story is they tracked down that woman who said her neighbor's friend's daughter said a thing, and she walked it back almost immediately and apologized. If rumors are participatory, though, there's also for centuries been this other narrative shaping system, which for a very long time ordinary people did not participate in at all. They were very much on the outside of. So this one moved information from the top down. Official voices and preferred sources, people with power, delivered approved messages via a mass media ecosystem that they largely controlled. But in each of these two distinct systems of influence, you have people taking in messages, whether from the top down or the bottom up, discussing what they see in the media, and then talking amongst themselves in their communities and deciding what's real and true. So you have these two very, very different sets of inputs, and then you have kind of mainstream media, news coverage, a barrage of information that's coming at you at all times. And so people have always shaped each other's interpretation of reality, and I want to talk a little bit about what's actually different today. So one very, very important component of propaganda and of opinion shaping writ large is the infrastructure on which information travels. So media theorists noted that the structure of the communication ecosystem actually shaped the message itself, right? So the kinds of content that were made for radio, people really excelled at making content for radio, really shifted pretty profoundly when all of a sudden there was a visual image that went along with it. The kind of people that became prominent or famous or, popular within that media ecosystem. You see this movement to television. People get more attractive if they're on TV. You see this interesting shift in what the form incentivizes. So technology delivers new affordances, and then the business interests that surround the new technology operate according to their own system of incentives. So one of the things that you see here too is that as you move from print to radio to television, you see the rise of advertising as a business model. You see coverage being shaped by that system of incentives. If pharmaceutical companies are advertising in your media outlet might not cover pharmaceutical companies as aggressively as it otherwise might. There's a system of incentives that shape the outputs, and this is a thing that Noam Chomsky wrote an entire book about called Manufacturing Consent in the 1980s, detailing how that system of incentives combined with that type of technology shapes the output and the content that people see. So as far as the participatory nature, though, you have this dynamic where when the printing press was invented, those with the capacity to print could hand out pamphlets to the local pub. People could pass them along to their friends, right? So people did play a little bit of a distribution role in that ecosystem. But then that stops for a while in radio and television. People talk about what they see, but they're not as active in terms of the participatory process. Then the internet comes around, right? The early internet, which all of a sudden gives everyone both the ability to create and disseminate the messages. You can start a blog and you can say whatever you want on your blog. You have that power to have that megaphone. Of course, the real experience, like show of hands here, anybody have a blog in, I'll date myself, like the early 90s maybe? Okay, so like one other person. Did anybody read it? Because nobody read mine, you know? So you had this interesting dynamic where, you could say something, but did anybody see it? No, not really. What happens, though, is that all of a sudden social media becomes the way that people begin to engage on the internet. And this, too, right, form changes content. All of a sudden, I don't know if this happened to other people, but I thought, why am I writing long form for my blog now if I can write a tweet? Right? Why would I bother doing that when I can just, weigh in on the issues that I care about in this entirely different type of media environment? And so each platform had slightly different features and affordances, though they have largely similar incentives, right? They are largely monetizing based on ads. In order to monetize based on ads, you need to keep people on site. So even though they feel very different in terms of how you use them, they're all in competition with each other. Individuals, people, users, are the glue within this system, right? They're both creating the content, but they're also moving it from one platform to the other. So the user actually has an incredible amount of power in terms of that transition, in terms of like shaping those information flows, because you have to think about it as the structure of the entire complex system. While you might be thinking about individual platform control over one sphere, Facebook, Meta's algorithms controlling Meta's properties, people become the links within this system, and they become the means by which the content travels from one to the other. So it's the structure of this system, the features, the policies, the design, and the ways that users interact that sets the rules of the game for modern influence. So just as new power structures emerged with the rise of mass media, a new power structure emerged in response to the infrastructure and incentives of this one. So one of the things that I found a little bit frustrating at times in media coverage of social media as a social media researcher is you usually see an article complaining about one of these things, right? Either it's the algorithm has done something bad, that influencer is saying bad things, or this crowd is being a bit unruly. They're not seeing it as a triad, right? As the incentives of the ecosystem as a whole are shaped by the relationship between these three things. So this triad, influencers, algorithms, and crowds, jointly shapes public opinion today. But unlike in the age of mass media, which, as we noted, folks like Noam Chomsky wrote about, one of the incentives of mass media was to appeal to as large an audience as possible. Most of these outlets were really working to reach a very broad spectrum audience. So Chomsky describes this as perpetuating hegemonic single narratives, right? Where the people are deceived in a sense. They don't see the full spectrum of opinions out there because media is sanitizing in order to appeal to as many people as possible. Social media incentivizes something completely different. It incentivizes a proliferation of niche realities because when you're moving things through this ecosystem, galvanizing a particular crowd around your ideas means that you're appealing to a much, much smaller set of people in order to make them feel passionately enough about the thing that you also care about. So social media incentivizes this proliferation of niches, and what starts to happen is each has their own consensus about what the facts of a particular matter are. So the influencer emerges from the crowd. They're a person who shares a large degree of either identity or mutual opinions with their followers, but they might just be a little bit more charismatic or more committed to expressing them. So they wind up with a little bit more in the way of followers. So the influencer becomes, in a sense, a gatekeeper, deciding what opinions and what content to share, and when they share it, since they have a large following, a lot of people see it. The influencer, though, is always aware that they're also creating content for the algorithm, because the algorithm decides what of the influencer's outputs to initially push to a particular subset of their followers. So even as the influencer is trying to appeal to a crowd, they're also trying to appeal to the algorithm. The algorithm also has to appeal to the crowd, because again, if the algorithm doesn't show people what they want to see, they're going to go off to the other platform to spend that free 20 minutes that they have. So you have the algorithm keying in on what the crowd might like and then pushing content out to the crowd. And then what you see the crowd do is it engages, and when it engages, it transmits signal back to the algorithm. So there's this very sort of mutually shaping system that's happening here, which is why it's important to think about it as a triad, not as any one thing that is now, or as any one leg of the stool, if you will, that's shaping public opinion. So the power to influence opinions increasingly lies with those who can most widely and effectively disseminate a message. And today, and I would argue this has always been true, but today it's not so much a function of mass media saying something on the nightly news, right? So you're not trying to get your point of view onto television. Instead, influencers, I can't say that fast. Influencers, algorithms, and crowds propagate the messages themselves, and what they're often doing in the realm of political activism is trying to disseminate those messages as widely and effectively as possible. Crowds really trust the influencers that are within their niche. They've chosen to follow them, and they see the influencer as a figure who speaks for them and who tells the truth even as other influencers and media in the other niches lie. So you start to have this incredibly trusted, close-knit relationship for spreading and propagating messages in the political realm, where all the other niches are seen as somehow other or somehow wrong or somehow dishonest. So when crowds and influencers activate around a particular message, which of course triggers the algorithmic lift, we say that something went viral. And this word, virality, describes how public opinion is heavily influenced on the internet. We use it most often in the passive voice. We say it went viral. But virality is not actually passive at all. It's a function of influencers, algorithms, and crowds taking very deliberate action, even if the crowd in particular may not be fully conscious of the role that individual decisions have in perpetuating this process. What you see in a lot of the media coverage of the pet eating debacle is that people say like, oh, well, I saw it and I thought it was interesting, so I shared it on. Well, I saw it in a Facebook group and I thought other people should know, so I put it on Twitter. Well, I hit the retweet button because I thought, well, yeah, no, I don't necessarily believe this, but it's very important that other people know, right? I'm just helping my community. I'm helping them understand. And so this process, it really is filling this participatory role in people's lives where they themselves are empowered to take an action to shape public opinion, but when things go a little bit off the rails, they don't necessarily think about the individual role that they themselves are playing in that process, because it's seen as such a machine, it's an emergent behavior, the system just does it. So there's a phrase that I started using to describe opinion shaping in niche realities back in 2015. So at the time, I wasn't in academia at all. I was a mom activist. I was living in California. I had a tech startup. And I had a baby in 2013. So when I was there with my child too young to be vaccinated, there was both a whooping cough and then a measles outbreak. And I was very frustrated personally by the anti-vaccine movement's social media dominance. This is because they'd really invested in it, right? They did not necessarily have access to getting their message out in media, because some of the narratives that they were still at the time trying to push, this false statement that vaccines cause autism, was something that media knew was untrue and no longer was willing to give airtime to. But they could get it out there very effectively on social media, and so they really invested in building that infrastructure, in having those influencers, in speaking to crowds in a way that the CDC and others, public health experts, did not. They didn't see this as necessarily worthy of an investment because they had always used this other channel, this other means of shaping public opinion, so why would you bother doing all of the hard work of doing this thing on the internet? So I was really struck by how much better anti-vaccine activists and ideologically aligned crowds were at making things trend. And I felt that the reality-based community, as it was sometimes jokingly referred to then, was it was just so much behind the ball. And I didn't quite realize then that reality itself was splintering. That even though this movement was very, very niche, it was incredibly effective at networking with other niche movements and cross-pollinating and trying to make other small groups of people jointly work to amplify each other's ideas and causes. And this was something that I think the institutional leaders did not see as worth their time. It was very effective at recruiting people, and social media algorithms, because they were there producing all of this content, were incredible at actually helping it get more lift. Because if you were a mom, when we started our pro-vaccine mom group, we went to Facebook's ad targeting tool and we tried to actually run a pro-vaccine ad campaign. And Facebook's ad targeting tool is populated by signals that users give about themselves. What do they write into their bios? How do they describe their interests? What sites are they sharing? So when we went to run a pro-public health messaging campaign and we went to start targeting along vaccine-related keywords, 100% of the vaccine-related keywords were anti-vaccine. There was actually no way to do this kind of targeting. And so this was one of these instances where we began to realize that not investing in this space had just created a sort of parallel environment where we had to then work essentially to be that kind of grassroots voice creating this, but at a time when we really needed it to already exist, because again, there was a measles outbreak, there was a whooping cough outbreak, there were efforts to pass laws in California to strengthen vaccine requirements in school. And that was, for me, I think, a kind of a watershed moment where I felt like this is going to be the future of all issues. This is the future of advocacy. This is the future of opinion shaping. And the institutions just do not understand what they're doing here. And I had a conversation at the time after we had, kind of gone through this advocacy effort. I spoke to some folks at the CDC. We went down there and we participated in this conference. And, the public health experts there were very dismissive of the idea that they needed to be engaging in this opinion-shaping universe. It was just some people on the internet, was how they described the online anti-vaccine movement. And they thought that people would still ultimately trust authority, would trust their doctors, because that's just what people do. But they do not. And the institutions got it wrong. And my book is about just how wrong they got it and why. Because when social media emerged, people thought of it as an inherently positive thing, right? Everyone would have a voice, good information and unheard perspectives would rise to the top. But just as propaganda evolved alongside mass media, in response to the technological structures and the business incentives of print and then radio and then television, propaganda also evolved to adapt to the social media infrastructure and incentives. And now it was very democratized and anyone could produce it. So influencers are incentivized to capture attention in order to maximize their revenue and their following, and they create content for algorithms and people. They work to appeal to a niche, to appeal to people based on their identity as members of a shared group. And one of the things that this did was as people began to see the power of social media to shape opinions, the byproduct of this was actually a rise and increased normalization of a very factional way of engaging. People began to see social media as a place to go fight with those other people. And so what you start to see happen is, rather than it being a place for discourse and everyone to get their opinions out there, what you start to see is the rise of factions, the rise of people using social media as a tool to attack other people. It's not echo chambers at all. People are seeing the other people's content and they're actually fighting more as a result, because that is what social media algorithms, they're rewarding that sensationalism, they're rewarding that, they see that signal of engagement. Fighting is engagement, and so that kind of dynamic gets amplified even more. So I would argue that we're witnessing this kind of Cambrian explosion of communities, and what we're starting to see is that each has their own norms and media and frameworks of facts. So individuals now can create very personalized versions of reality by selectively curating the information that they consume. And this is reinforced by algorithms and niche media that cater to specific biases. But unlike in authoritarian regimes, our misinformation, our rumor mill is not necessarily, it's not imposed upon us. We are quite voluntarily and cooperatively embracing it. This is what we see as normal now. Algorithms and media outlets happily supply content that echoes our preferences and enables us within our factions to construct, brick by brick, our own political, social, and religious realities. So I want to get out of the realm of the theoretical. There's plenty of that in the book, but I want to talk a little bit about how this manifested, some of the work that we did at Stanford Internet Observatory, looking at the effects of this system in the 2020 election. So in 2020, my team at Stanford Internet Observatory worked alongside the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, a company called Graphica that does network analyses, and the Digital Forensics Research Lab at the Atlantic Council, which studies a lot of extremism and state-sponsored propaganda content. And we decided that we were going to do this project looking at the 2020 election. And we used the word misinformation at the time. We were very interested in understanding. Now I think rumors is by far the more appropriate term, but rumors about voting, voting specifically. We were not looking at what candidate A said about candidate B. We were not interested in Hunter Biden's laptop, totally out of scope for us. We were very interested, though, in efforts to delegitimize the 2020 election by making allegations of fraud that were not supported. And we wanted to study, in fact, moments of inflection, what made rumors go viral. It should not surprise you to hear that the answer often was influencers. So this is a graph from Kate's team, but one of the things that we put up on the EIP blog at the time, this was Sharpiegate. How many people remember Sharpiegate? Yeah, I see some heads nodding here. Sharpiegate was the rumor that the election was going to be stolen in Arizona because Trump voters had been given Sharpie markers that machines would not read to read their ballots. So this was in Maricopa County, Arizona, which still is really a source of quite the narrative battleground. Was in 2022, will be in 2024. But what was very interesting about this was the situation progressed from a rumor that Sharpie markers weren't working to collective sense-making. Again, people in Facebook groups, on Parler, really trying to figure it out. Parler was actually one of the more interesting platforms for looking at this because people trusted each other on Parler and they weren't worried about like liberals making fun of them or anything. And so they're there just saying like, I don't know, guys, my ballot got read. What are you all talking about? Then on Twitter, once the narrative is established that this was how the steal was being conducted, none of that discussion happened anymore. Everybody was very much full steam ahead. And what you started to see was prominent political influencers, like Matt Schlapp up there, amplifying these claims, right? So again, that pickup, that hop from the rumor mill to the propaganda machine happens here too. And once again, you see election officials who are trying to reassure voters that everything was fine, but the job of election workers is not to be influencers on the internet. They usually don't have very much in the way of reach. They are usually not communicating very often except to put up kind of PSAs about on what date and time to show up to vote. So even as they're trying to correct the record, they're not getting any lift. They're not getting any amplification. There's no network out there. There's no crowd helping their content go viral and sharing it out. Sharpiegate was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, right? A piece of content that purported to show something. There's a suitcase outside of my polling place, for example. Somebody would take a picture of that. They would tag an influencer. The influencer would amplify it. It would often get up to an elite member of the Trump campaign, perhaps the president himself, often one of the president's sons. And you would see this ping-ponging. It would come from the bottom. Right-wing media would cover what people were saying online. Some people on the internet are saying that a suitcase has been found outside of this polling location. That article would then be, written up here in the sort of legacy media ecosystem and then bounced back down to the social media ecosystem. So you see this handoff from one to the next, and this happened over and over and over again. And it's important to note that elite leaders set that frame of fraud at the top. They established the propaganda narrative now known as the steal, which was the false claim that the 2020 election would be stolen. But it was rumors that came from the crowd that backfilled that narrative, that provided the evidence. So you have the statement and the crowd provides the evidence that the propaganda machine needs. And it's happening, it's almost like finding facts, but in reverse. You have the story and then you're gonna just backfill it. And you see this happen over and over and over again. And this was the story of 2020. So one of the things that we looked at when we did this massive research project was policy and to what extent policy shapes propagation, right? So all of this is happening on a social media infrastructure, which means that the affordances of social media are driving what is shared and when, but the policies of social media are what actually regulate the content. And so we did this big analysis trying to understand how social media policies, this was done after the fact, not during the election, but after the fact, we were looking at what were the ways in which these policies determined what was able to go viral. So this was a really interesting challenge because the policies, the policies of the infrastructure providers, if you will, the controllers of the algorithms, they were actually alarmed at what was happening. And you see this come out after the fact in leaks. You see this come out, the Haugen leaks, for example. They didn't know what to do. So they tried to do, they were trying to do labeling. Labeling is a way to allow content to stay up, doesn't create a backfire effect that comes when you take it down. The labels would often just say something like, this content is disputed, go visit the Facebook Election Center for more information. Twitter was doing largely the same thing. But they didn't want to be seen as stifling free expression, which is a good thing, right? That is, what we want. We want those expressions to be out there because if you take them down, you do create this backfire effect. But they were not necessarily particularly effective at figuring out what to label or labeling uniformly, which created a sense that they were labeling unfairly, and that led to some legitimacy challenges. So we, in our work at the Election Integrity Partnership, we occasionally spoke to state and local election officials who were trying to figure out whether some rumor mattered, whether a fake account pretending to be a poll worker was, they were actually very concerned about the Russians, for example. We tried to help triage these rumors that election officials were seeing to help them out, because this is not their job. Their job is to run an election, not to be sitting there on social media. We also occasionally sent tips to platforms when we found rumors that were beginning to go viral that appeared to violate their policies. And then after the fact, we looked to see what they did with that. And we found that in 60% of cases, they did nothing. So this was a very interesting finding, right? So about 4,000 URLs that we sent over, 60% of the time they did nothing. And about 30% of the time they put up a label, and about 10% of the time the content came down. So we did this work to try to understand how rumors moved, how public opinion was shaped, what it was about the steal that was so compelling. And it really reinforced for us, because this, of course, is what winds up happening. And, they're there chanting these slogans that we've been seeing online for months, right? The crowd is there screaming the things that have been hashtags on the internet. And so this idea that, gosh, can we know if propaganda is having an effect in the real world? Yes, we can. We see it constantly, actually. And so a lot of the work that we wound up doing then was trying to almost piece together after the fact, to write the explainer, to help people understand what had happened here, what that rumor mill looked like, what those inflection points were, how the policies intersected, and just how this very complicated system had led us to this moment. This was our report for anybody who wants to read it. So this went up on the internet in March of 2021. What happened next? So then things started to get weird. So in late 2022, we became the subject of the rumor mill and then the propaganda machine, right? So a series of events beginning in November 2022 led to a new round of rumors about election 2020, which many elected Republican congressmen continued to allege had been stolen. They had, you'll recall, worked through many, many court cases trying to figure out how exactly the supposed steal had happened, right? A lot of investigations into whether there were fibers and ballots, a lot of cyber ninjas trying to figure out if machines had been hacked. And when all of these things came up short, the narrative changed, and we started to see high-profile Republican influencers beginning to allege that the Election Integrity Partnership, had actually helped to steal the election, that we had suppressed true stories of election theft, true stories of voting malfeasance, and that in our vicious acts of suppression, the public had been underinformed, and that was why Donald Trump had lost. So I started to read, I would have like Google alerts that would come in around our work and stuff, and I started reading these wild stories alleging that I specifically had FBI-level access to Twitter's internal systems, which is a sentence that means nothing in addition to being not true. But then there were also claims that the Election Integrity Partnership, which was largely staffed by Stanford students and other students and analysts from the other three organizations, had built an AI Death Star censorship superweapon designed to simply nuke entire narratives from the internet. And what were the narratives that we nuked? Well, they went to our report and they pulled up this list of the most viral narratives that we had tracked. We added up at the end, months after the election, we added up the number of tweets that had been in this conversation, these top 10 most viral stories: Dominion voting machines, Sharpiegate, Maidengate, these things that everybody who paid attention knew about. And they said, no, in fact, we had nuked all of those stories from the internet. That number at the bottom of the column, when you added it up, was 22 million tweets. And so they said we had censored 22 million tweets from the internet. Now, never mind that we hadn't. They alleged that the government had told us to do this. Well, the government at the time, you'll recall, was the Trump government. But again, reality all of a sudden didn't matter because the fantasy industrial complex mounted a full-bore political machine attack. Elon Musk began the Twitter files, which allowed handpicked scribes to investigate Twitter's internal emails. And they began to investigate, as they put it, quote unquote, censorship at Twitter during the Jack Dorsey regime. And their articles began to just kind of regurgitate the material that was appearing in the right-wing blogs. Some of the writers were invited to testify in front of Jim Jordan's Weaponization Committee in Congress. And in their written testimony, they said that we censored 22 million tweets. This is remarkable because they were appealing to their authority as these people with supposed firsthand knowledge into Twitter's internal emails, and yet none of this was actually in Twitter's internal emails because it hadn't happened. But they became very effective at taking this particular propaganda narrative, moving it through, getting it all the way to Congress, and then all of a sudden, 2 days after that hearing in which these crazy allegations were made, Jim Jordan's committee sent a letter to Stanford notifying us that we were to turn over all of our emails with government and tech platforms going back to 2015. What was incredibly remarkable about it was that that was then quickly escalated to a subpoena. One of the real challenges here is that a lot of the work that we did was done with students, which meant that simply turning things over actually came with very significant kind of legal ramifications, right? Also, the fact is, we knew that everything that we turned over was going to be leaked and that the purpose was really to create a harassment mob, not to do any actual legislative fact-finding. And so that also led to, to some interesting challenges as I and those of us who were senior on the project really wanted our stuff out there with our names on it, but also wanted to make sure that we were able to protect the students. So in this situation, though, as with the pet eaters, as with the theory of the steal, you see the online and the offline blend. So the political elites pulled from online rumors and crank theories, again, from these sort of propagandistic, Substack rags and random blogs, and they used the online chatter as pretext to launch some very, very real investigations. So it may surprise you to hear that in 2024 in America, a random person with some following can make a baseless allegation about you. An influencer with a large enough audience can echo it, and then a member of Congress can consider this sufficient justification to send you a subpoena to investigate you and your work. But in fact, that is actually all it takes. And so anybody who is doing public interest research needs to really understand that, because this was this was a surprise to me. I really thought, okay, there's got to be some evidence in order to justify these things. But it turns out, no, that is not true. I followed this situation thinking, okay, eventually we'll get to the moment of vindication, right? We'll turn over all of our emails, we'll turn over all of our internal working, projects and things. The government will get what it's asking for, as frustrating as it is, as illegitimate as the investigation is, and then we'll get to the part where the vindication happens. It turns out, though, that the vindication via traditional pathways takes like years. And in the meantime, while you are told to shut up and say nothing as this entire online machine is blowing up, the hyper-partisan propaganda machine will convict you in the court of public opinion long before the actual vindication process of you turning over your emails happens. So this was a very interesting experience for me. It's an incredible work of art there. That's me. I had been giving a public talk that, again, also sat on the internet for 3 years. I keynoted at a DHS conference and a public lecture, and they just kind of put the Orwell words behind me to make me look scary. But this Substacker, he submitted written testimony to Congress and, accused me of all sorts of evil doing, bad beliefs, crazy, crazy theories, and made these 20-minute long videos, wrote dozens of articles about me, claimed I was secretly a CIA plant at Stanford, that the CIA had placed me at Stanford because 20 years ago when I was an undergraduate, I did an internship there. But the problem is, when these rumors about you, when these smear campaigns go on the internet, there's, of course, the cost is you will be harassed by a mob. This is what happens. And even after, one of the things that happens is that they build you up into this character in a cinematic universe over time. They're profiting from this. It's incredibly effective for them. You have your own life and things you are supposed to be doing, and I am not, it turns out, profiting from refuting crazy rumors about myself on the internet. And so it's an incredibly asymmetric process. The other thing you begin to realize very quickly is you can be out there countering these things, putting out the facts, saying, hey, this is or is not true. But if they don't trust you anyway, then it's not going to make a difference. And so you find yourself in this remarkable kind of mirror world situation where you just kind of get comfortable with the fact that people are going to believe a thing in this alternate reality, and you have no power to shift that belief. That you can do all the counter speaking in the world, but because of the way the infrastructure works, because of the intense, niche partisan tribal dynamics here, you actually don't have the power to shift that narrative. So it's a remarkable experience to think, I sit here telling people about the importance of counter speech, and I really believe it, but it's not necessarily, unfortunately, going to do a lot when you find yourself in these situations. What was very frustrating about this was that, this particular individual was also rewarded for this behavior. He became a hero. He was exposing the head of the censorship industrial complex. He was rewarded with an anonymously endowed chair at the heterodox university, right? So it was an incredible dynamic to watch this play out, to be, watching myself become a character with no ability to really do anything about it at all. And unfortunately, this is now a very established playbook. And the people who do this, they really know their roles. And one of the things that you see happen is, again, when these stories come out, when these lies are written, when these articles are are moved through this, this ecosystem, you see some of the biggest influencers in the world now, Elon Musk, more followers than anybody else on the platform he owns, becomes instrumental in disseminating it. And again, you have this incredible challenge of the megaphone is pointing in one direction and you do not have access to it. And so you are speaking to an entirely different universe of people. Again, if you make it trend, you make it true. So the last stage in the process that kind of came for us was the lawfare. And we were sued twice, personally in my individual capacity, as well as Stanford being sued, with individual researchers named personally alongside laundry lists of government officials. They really wanted to sue the government, but they also wanted to sort of suck us into this. Materials that Jim Jordan obtained under that congressional subpoena and interviews that he did with my colleagues behind closed doors were also just turned over to plaintiff's counsel. They just got to plaintiff's counsel. So this was another incredible experience where this group, America First Legal, is run by Stephen Miller, the Trump administration official. And so all of a sudden what you start to see is this handoff where when you're subpoenaed by Congress, the material that you turn over, it turns out, you know, they can kind of do whatever they want with it. And so it's rather unprecedented to have them turn it over to a lawsuit mill, but that's, you know, that seems to be what happened because it got there somehow. The suits make allegations about us. They say things like we are de facto agents of the United States government. Why? Well, because we got an NSF grant. 2 years after the project was completed, we got an NSF grant. Retroactively, we are de facto agents of the government. This is a wild legal theory. This will not stand up. This will not hold any water. But this is the sort of thing that you have to spend about 2 years litigating, it turns out. So anybody who is in the audience, professors who have NSF grants, congratulations. You too are agents of the deep state. And I can't talk about the specifics of the cases because they're still pending. The book went through 6 rounds of legal review. The chilling effect is very real. And maybe at some point that becomes the subject of the next book. But the purpose of running these kinds of campaigns, these smear campaigns, is to target researchers and to silence them. And it's to render certain types of work dangerous, not worth doing, to erode the protection of academic freedom, and to stifle the free speech of political enemies through intimidation campaigns. It is now considered risky for American academics to study American elections. It is considered risky for academics to communicate with state and local election officials, or with the federal government, or with the tech platforms. Any act of communication is recast as a cabal. This is a new McCarthyism, and institutions are struggling to adapt. We were not the first to go through this. It did not start with us. It will not end with us. As I began to, get used to this weird mirror world, climate scientists that had gone through it in 2012 reached out and said, let me tell you what's going to happen over the next year and a half. And they just laid out the same playbook that, that came for us, had been very effectively run against them in 2012. Naomi Oreskes wrote an incredible book, Merchants of Doubt, and it details how it came for scientists studying the effects of tobacco, the fact that tobacco caused cancer, the extent to which smear campaigns are used to delegitimize academic research and findings that are inconvenient to incredibly politically powerful people. I think a lot of people know about this. It's weird when the Washington Post, covers what happens to your team. But unfortunately, Stanford decided to exit rapid response election research. And several of us weren't renewed for funding reasons. There was also something of a funding shortfall. But ultimately, this was really kind of hailed as a victory by the congressman who wrote some gloating tweets saying that he had exercised robust oversight over Stanford University and had rooted out the heads of the censorship industrial complex. I think it's absolutely astonishing to be in a moment when sitting congressmen are gloating about exercising robust oversight over academic institutions, as if determining what academics can study or say is the role or the remit of the weaponization committee of the US House of Representatives. So what now? Well, we're not going to fact check our way out of this, right? The problem that I am describing in the book and in this talk is not about social media manipulation. That's been a bit of a misdiagnosis for a long time because it frames it as a problem of facts and truth. And if you only get more facts out there, then people will understand the truth and we will return to a shared reality. We should be seeing this as a crisis of trust, one that is partially organic. I spend a lot of time in the book on actual institutional failures, right? Because it's not only the internet, there are real world things that are happening that are leading to this distrust. But also at the same time, it is also quite deliberate. People who with incredible power and voice on the internet have realized that delegitimizing their opponents is more effective than refuting what they have to say. And that has unfortunately carried up to the highest levels of Congress as well. So we have to devise meaningful responses to a new system of narrative power. The influencers, algorithms, and crowds who shape public opinion via viral rumors, the political influencers and elites who parlay them into propaganda campaigns. We have to recognize this as a very intentional playbook and to think about means for counterspeech and ways to engage quite differently. I actually can't see time, so I hope somebody waves at me when we're if I'm going too long. But I think first we need to be reevaluating the outputs that the incentives of social media are creating. So in the Q&A, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the specifics around policy, education, and design responses. I wrote a very long chapter on this in the book. It could, I think, be a whole separate talk on its own. But for now, suffice to say that the policy solutions we need should be focused on ensuring transparency and accountability. We often view these issues through the lens of the US culture wars, but platform incentives are impacting communities globally. Their policies are impacting communities globally. And what we're seeing is that as Congress has begun doing things like subpoenaing them also, right, doing the same kinds of things to them, sort of cudgeling and browbeating and jawboning them, what you're seeing is that they're becoming progressively less transparent. And so a lot of people who do social media research struggle today to do even the kind of work we were able to do in 2020. So that, I think, is something where questions around how to create that transparency is critically important. I think design solutions are also incredibly important. If you believe that form shapes output, right, and incentives are influencers are acting in response to incentives, then thinking upstream, not about content moderation on the bad stuff at the end, but what are the incentives? How does the design of a platform shape those outputs? That's, I think, what we really need to be doing to look at how to build bridging spaces, how to create consensus, how to bring some of the niches back together. So these are the areas where I think that things like middleware that let users have a little bit more control over moderation and curation create a sense of legitimacy, give the user a sense of agency. I think that design tools like bridging algorithms are critically important, which rather than amplifying the most sensational voice in a conversation, incentivizing that rage, instead amplify voices that articulate very, very complex, challenging problems, but in ways that don't immediately seek to alienate or to attack the other side. So the work on bridging algorithms, I think, is really being aided in some kind of funny ways by AI. This is one of the things where AI, large language models in particular, are actually good at understanding context, cultural context in ways that human moderators often are not. So there's going to be some interesting shifts, I think, in how both moderation and curation systems will shift and will evolve as new technology kind of comes into the space. And then I would say education is also key to empowering individuals with media and AI literacy skills and enabling them to assess the information that they counter online, not even necessarily from a factual standpoint, but just recognizing the kinds of words that trigger outrage, the kinds of tropes that recur, that handoff from the rumor mill to the propaganda machine, what propagandistic language looks like when you see tweets talking about they, that should be a red flag, these sorts of ways in which we can actually call on counter-propaganda work that the United States civil societies were doing in the 1930s as, as radio influencers were descending into fascism. They did it again in the 1980s during the Cold War. There are ways that we can be drawing on our understanding from environments past and just thinking about how do we update that for the present communication ecosystem. We need to rethink how we behave on social media. This, again, to the point about our own individual agency here, what we share, what we do, how we speak. We can demand better norms from our own communities. Because I think that the pervasive acrimonious dissensus leaves us unable to respond to collective crises. When you're constantly seeing your fellow citizen as an opponent, you cannot have that bridging, you cannot solve collective problems. This too might benefit, again, from things like the technological assists of bridging algorithms. We need to elect boring politicians, right? This is unfortunately a collective action problem too. As long as playing influencer delivers votes, they will continue to do it, right? But it is voters who have the power to say, hey, I want you to actually be focusing on what matters, not brawling on social media all day long. So I do really think that unfortunately we've created an environment where the current crop of political candidates is really the sort of social media brawler class, and it would be really great to find a way to move past that. For the researchers in the room, researchersupport.org, Rebecca Trombl's team at George Washington University has been doing a very, very focused project. This is not only limited to professors, this is for anybody who's doing research, including graduate students, research assistants, people who are working in spaces that become hotly contested, people who unfortunately randomly find themselves on the wrong side of, some unwanted attention on social media because of an ill-considered tweet, right? The question is, how can you build those communities of support so that people don't exit the conversation, so that we do have that counter speech, we do have those alternate perspectives in the room. We do also need to be supporting researchers in particular, and so helping them understand what happens when the subpoenas come down, or what the letter from Congress means, or how to engage in the hearing. These are the sorts of things, how the institution also can support the researcher. I think that a lot of institutions are very well-meaning. Stanford was exceptional with supporting us with legal assistance. I think that there's been really quite the gamut in considering how to respond from a comms perspective, or how to handle researchers when, you get profiled on InfoWars. And then for the other, just people who are watching or are participants in social media but are not necessarily concerned about the other things, we do have the ability to shift how we respond. We can take individual actions to empower ourselves. We can think much more consciously about when and how we contribute to viral moments by, keeping these sorts of things in mind. So we all have a role to play in reclaiming truth and accountability in a world where fragmented information flows and decentralized power shape reality. It's no longer just up to institutions to put out the facts, or just up to platforms to moderate communities or stamp out falsehoods. Each of us has power and agency, and we shape our environment, and so we must engage. By being discerning about what we share, advocating for platform transparency and accountability, and demanding integrity from our leaders, we can help shape that information ecosystem that defines our futures. So I would say don't disengage, push for better practices, help your family and community with information literacy, be mindful of the realities that we co-create with every click and share. Our capacity for consensus in a hyper-connected world isn't predetermined. We can shape it, but we all must commit to building a shared reality that prioritizes accuracy over spectacle and integrity over mere influence. And so I would leave you with the question, how do we rise to that challenge? And then this is the book, which spends 400 pages on this. And then here is me. And I spend a lot of time on Threads and Blue Sky and Mastodon, and I really do like talking to people, so reach out.
Thank you so much for a thought-provoking talk. Professor DiResta, we're going to have Professor DiResta join Professor Jenna Bednar up at the talk to discuss some questions that we have received from audience members today. So I'll welcome you up. As Dean Solomon mentioned, Professor Bednar is the Faculty Director of UMich Votes and Democratic Engagement and a Professor of Public Policy and Political Science here at the university. And we can't think of a better person to just moderate a thoughtful conversation today. We did receive many excellent questions from folks today, and unfortunately, I suspect we won't be able to get to them all, but we have about half an hour together for a moderated conversation, and I welcome everyone at 4 o'clock when we wrap up to continue the conversation. We'll be having a reception across the hall, and Professor DiResta will be signing books there, so I hope we can continue the conversation into the afternoon. So with that, I'll pass it over to Professor Bednar.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you, Renee. That was really fabulous, and so many directions we could head into. Before we start, I want to ask Laura, is it also possible for people here to be asking questions if they didn't submit them in advance?
We have a microphone and I can walk around.
Okay, all right. So I'm just going to kick us off, but consider this your opportunity to start thinking about what you might want to ask. And I want to start actually where you ended in a way, because let's go back to when it was that triad that you had, the influencer, the crowd, and the algorithm. And I have to say, not being a specialist at all in this field, that before I saw your talk, and I cannot wait to read the book, I really was all about, oh, it's the algorithm, right? And maybe the influencers. But as I was looking at that, I was thinking, how is this different from traditional media? Because we could use those, substitute in old-fashioned words for the same functionality, except that here, that crowd is doing a really different thing, right? And I was thinking about what this crowd is and does. That's us. Right? And we are distributors of this, whatever is being fed to us. So we redistribute it and we tweak, we add a little bit to it. So we're also content creators a little bit. And Scott Pages in the room has done a lot of work on collective intelligence. I started thinking about it as like, maybe this is collective disintelligence. I don't know if that's a word, but now it is. So you give us a lot of positive hope, recognizing this agency, responsibility, guilt that we have, right? I don't know, though, if we're up to it, because I think that we have shown that we're actually not valuing information as our number one priority. Like, we want to be entertained. We love the snark. So could you just...
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that I've really been fascinated by, how many people here are on Blue Sky? Like one. Oh my gosh, you guys, go join. Threads? Okay, interesting, more Threads. I too love Threads. As Twitter shifted, right, again, in response to the direction a platform owner chose to take it, the direction that the curatorial algorithm went, which was to surface content from paid accounts, because the business incentive was to make people subscribe. People subscribed, their content was boosted in feed. So much of what happens in the Twitter kind of design space is happening in response to Elon trying to make money in particular ways, as advertisers in particular have backed away because of some of the perhaps unintended, perhaps intended, opinions vary, consequences of like what is amplified on the platform now. But one of the things that's happening simultaneously is that users are leaving. And we've seen exoduses before. The sort of first round of people moving into alt platforms happened on the right. Parler, Gab, Getter, Truth Social came a little bit later. But they were doing that because they wanted to be in a different type of environment, and they wanted to be, they thought, among the like-minded, but then actually they realized that what they wanted to do was brawl. And a lot of the reason why those platforms didn't succeed quite so well, we sort of jokingly say, is there were no libs to own, right? That was, they were there to own the libs and nobody on the left joined. But what's happening on the other platforms, on Mastodon, on Blue Sky, on Threads, is you are actually seeing the early adopter communities really shaping the norms in very direct ways. So you go on Blue Sky, and about I think they had about 500,000 signups yesterday, and they had about 500,000 signups yesterday because Elon Musk announced, or Twitter engineering announced, that they were changing how blocking was going to work on X. They were making it now so that block just meant that a person couldn't respond to you, but they could still see your post. So this was something that really alienated a lot of users who want to use block to just get rid of people. They don't want people then still creeping on their content. And so you saw 500,000 signups on Blue Sky. So you see, and then as people are landing on Blue Sky, the community on Blue Sky is welcoming them. They're dropping things like, hey, we have these things called starter packs. Here's people you can follow. We have these sorts of things where if you don't want to see certain types of content in your feed, here's the very granular labeling system you can sign up for, which will sort of filter it out. And you actually do see that in these, like, maybe you call it like fresh spaces, there is some demand for that. And so I think that a lot of it comes from the norms that the community establishes early on, and you are seeing a lot of the other types of conversation on Blue Sky is people saying, like, we do block, we don't tolerate this kind of speech, we don't want hate here, right? And so it's very interesting to see this community norm shaping. You see it happen on Reddit also, another example of like the subreddits that have their own distinctive cultures. So I think that it is possible. I don't know that you can necessarily achieve it on very large entrenched platforms, but as if you want to go to Mastodon, you can find servers that are aligned with your values and spend your time there and engage with your people there. So I think maybe we're moving away from a mass social media experience where we all need to be on the same platform to an environment where if you're facilitating new market entrants and giving people places that they want to be, they will go there and they will shape and create healthier norms. I find Threads very, very useful for getting information. Even as when I pop back over to Twitter, I feel like I don't know what's real a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was early-ish on Blue Sky and find that it was kind of lovely at the beginning. It's become a little bit of a lefty hot take zone. Yes, yeah. And I really miss the old Twitter, I will say, where I could be really heavily curate who I was following, and it was a source of information. And I hope you're right, because I do believe in us as humans. We are almost all care about one another. I just don't know that we see that online. And so in addition to being concerned about disinformation, what about what this is doing to our social fabric? That is, all of the violent rhetoric, all of the basic unkindness that gets normalized in that space and then bleeds over into real life. We had some ugliness on our campus this week, and so do you see? You're so strangely positive, I have to say, given your experience.
It goes back and forth. Depends on the day. No, I think I spend a bunch of time on the book on the like what happened to public health officials, and if you watched Hurricane Helene and Milton play out, death threats to weathermen, the kind of like each random professions just wind up in the center of it for a brief moment in time. No, I mean it is bad, and I think that one of the problems is I'll just say it. I feel like the norms on Twitter in particular, bleeding offline, were very, very destructive. Because when you normalize the idea that shouting people down is the appropriate response, and then they go and do that in the real world also, then it comes with an additional feeling of like threat, and then people really back out of the conversation. So there's been a lot of efforts now to do things like, Better Angels, which is a group that tries to bring people together in person, believing that you have to repair some of those conversations, some of those relationships locally, as opposed to worrying about the entire internet. The entire internet is its own thing, but how do you make people within those geographically constrained communities feel a sense of community? I know there's a lot of Facebook groups for local neighborhoods now. There's also entire apps devoted to local neighborhoods that are also trying to figure out how do you diffuse situations, how do you use bridging algorithms to shift norms. I think it takes some time, the same way it took some time to get to this point. But But there's an awful lot of work being done on what's called pro-social design that is trying to create healthier spaces so that you can kind of reference those offline norms in online spaces in hopes of, again, minimizing the devolution of offline norms.
I mean, 100%. So many of us who care about this recognize that we have to take it back down to a human scale, get people just to talk with one another and find the common ground that really does exist. So you're talking about local groups, and Facebook is pretty good about that. What about something that is as kind of huge as Twitter or a Blue Sky?
Blue Sky, you can also do quite a bit to kind of curate who you see. Like, I'm in a gardening feed. I have a little garden. I'm not very good at gardening. And I just have a feed that I actually just go to, like, I would say probably once a week to look for some help or ask a question or something. And I think, anybody who follows me can also see the stuff that I post to that feed. So there's, it can kind of like bleed into other areas. But you can create these very focused experiences that are, on a large platform still feel small, if you will. I spent most of my time on Twitter until I became the subject of the Twitter files, in fact. So it was I missed it. Like, I do also feel that sense of nostalgia for the kind of Twitter where you would have conversations. But one thing that's been very interesting about Threads, which is different than Blue Sky, is that Threads incentivizes conversations. It does not actually, it's not the megaphone aspect of it is a little bit inscrutable. Like, they're having some problems right now with bait posts. If you frame a post as a question, but like in a sort of sensational, trolly way, you'll get a whole lot of responses because the algorithm actually is trying to incentivize the creation of conversation. And so as people have realized that, they'll, make these kind of crazy, semi-funny posts that are like, like things about like, what should I feed my kids? Should I, I can't think of a specific example right now. I'm a little bit too jet lagged for that, but it is very much this dynamic of facilitating conversation as opposed to more of a megaphone follower model like happened on Twitter. Will it work? I don't know, but you're seeing different platforms experiment with creating different feels so that I don't think that people necessarily all need to be on the same platform. I think it's fine to say, I post this to Blue Sky and this to Threads and that to Mastodon, and I am okay having that gap. Maybe, there had never been a global public square of any kind before, even a national public square for that matter. And so this idea of can you have that can you create content moderation and norms and frameworks at a global scale? I mean, maybe the answer to that experiment is just no, and we are going to see these smaller pockets begin to emerge.
A lot of us are thinking about the upcoming election. And I wonder if you could just share with us what you're seeing in the information manipulation space. And in particular, I asked you about this earlier, the targeting of specific subpopulations. And so what are you seeing?
Yeah, so I'm actually, so my time at Stanford ended in June, and so I didn't have access to a lot of the same tools I would have had to answer that question. But no, there's 404 Media put out a really fantastic article today that I was reading just before we started about a particular political PAC that was running Kamala Harris ads, attack ads. I am trying to remember the specifics. It had some of the images were Kamala stands with Israel. Some of it was Kamala is two-faced and stands with Palestine. And they were the same PAC had the Kamala supports Israel and the Kamala supports Palestine ads, and they were ad targeting them to different groups of people. I think if I recall correctly, the Israel ad was targeted at Michigan voters and the Palestine ad was targeted at Pennsylvania voters. And so you can see the effects of ad targeting are such that the content that you're seeing is so personalized to you. We've known this for a long time. The question is, how does that information get conveyed to the public? You can read it in these sort of like, these media outlets that choose to cover it, but the question is, does it get seen by all the people who've seen the ads? You almost need to like run another ad targeting campaign pushing the article about the ads to the same people who saw the ads, because otherwise, unfortunately, the fact check or correction or clarification, contextualization doesn't reach the same people. So there's that. I've been spending a little bit more time, I did some work on analyzing the state actor takedowns, so the Russia stuff, the Iran stuff that's happened, writing a little bit about that. I haven't spent as much time on domestic rumors. Again, access to tools. Kate Starboard's team is still doing that. EIP doesn't exist anymore, but University of Washington is still doing that rumor control project, rumor assessment project. Rumor Control was the name of the website that one of the government entities had put up to try to do its own fact checking before people said that rumor control sounded creepy. So here we are.
Just if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and Laura will come by. Could you tell us why you switched to the word rumor?
Because it actually described what was happening. One of the things that we constantly encountered was a claim would go viral, and we would go looking for a fact check, right? To kind of like to see why was this not yet fact checked? Did a fact check exist? Was it a time break issue? And a lot of the time, like the complaints about Sharpie markers, somebody has to actually go and do the work of that fact check. They've got to actually sit down with some election official who knows something. They've got to write it up. They've got to analyze it. There's like a time lag there. And you actually couldn't immediately know what was true all of the time. This happened a lot in health misinformation, as the term went, that was really health rumors because it was people relating a personal experience they had. I got a vaccine, I had a side effect. That's not misinformation. You actually have no idea. Or you would hear, I've referenced this, like there was a notorious Nicki Minaj one that happened where, she was talking about a particular notorious side effect that her, husband's friend's cousin or something experienced. And again, that's not misinformation. We don't know that guy. We don't know what happened to him. It's a friend of a friend's story. And as you saw, so much of what was happening in the quote unquote election misinformation space was really election rumors. It was people who were very concerned, sharing it amongst themselves. It was not possible to know what the truth was in that very moment. And it was going to take some time. And so it was, misinformation was, I think, actually quite a counterproductive word for people to be using because, again, sometimes it turns out to be true, right? Sometimes the crowd does have this knowledge early on and the media or authority figures do not. And so rumors are a term that we've had to describe exactly this process since, the Middle Ages. And so it seems to make more sense, I would argue, to contextualize this as a modern rumor mill, a technologically enhanced rumor mill, than misinformation.
Prematurely judging the truthiness
Yes.
of it. There were a few people who submitted questions that I'm going to paraphrase, and that along this line, the freedom of speech feature of the First Amendment. So how do we regulate harmful or false content but still protect freedom of speech?
Yeah, so first, I would argue that the government has no role to play in content moderation. And I know that not everybody agrees with me on that, but that's my opinion on it. I think that the government has its own First Amendment rights, and I think that the government reaching out to a platform and saying, hey, this is what is actually true about the vaccine, or hey, here's sort of our official point of view on this. We'd like to make sure that this too is in the conversation. That's perfectly acceptable. That's government speaking, participating in the conversation. When you get into government requesting things like takedowns, which again is happening quite a bit from non-U.S. governments, you see global governments using their power to try to ask platforms to take content down. The U.S. government does it much less frequently. What you see much more often is they'll flag a list of accounts and they'll say something like, we suspect these to be Russian accounts. This is something you did see in the Twitter files, where then Twitter would go and would take these lists and would decide whether or not to action based on their own moderation rules. And it was the same thing when we engaged with them about content, where we were like, hey, I think this violates your policies. Here's this rumor, it's going viral, have a look. Again, they always kind of had that ultimate determination. So then if we hold the government outside of it, then you have the platforms. And this is where, ironically, one of the reasons why this has become a political issue is because the platforms are, I don't know if vulnerable is the word, but they are responsive to what we call ref working. So if people express consternation about how they're moderating something, you do in fact see them respond at times. And this is one of the reasons why you see political groups arguing that this moderation or that moderation is unfair, because they are responsive to it. One of the things that I think has to happen, though, is you need to have, you may want them to maximize free expression. I think we do want them to maximize free expression. There are certain things, though, where you can allow content to be on the platform without proactively amplifying it, without proactively recommending it. So if you want to have an anti-vaccine group, that's great, have your anti-vaccine group, but Facebook's recommendation engine does not need to necessarily be proactively pushing that to people. You're not...
It is the algorithm.
Sometimes, yeah. Well, no, I mean, it is this, the wheel turns. But it is that dynamic of, and this is, funny enough, this was work that Asa Raskin and I began making this argument in around 2018. We said freedom of speech is not the same as freedom of reach. There are differences between amplification and hosting. And really ironically, because you never know where your work is going to end up, Elon Musk picked up that phrase, and it is now at the top of his content moderation policy, and it is literally in his algorithm as well. There is a comment, like a little function about freedom of reach. So I'm glad we all agree. But in all seriousness, I think a lot of people think that you can just take bad ideas out of a conversation. You can't, and people need to internalize that very, very deeply. You have to either be counter-speaking, again, like I was alluding to with the bridging algorithms, or you have to recognize that if a platform decides to take content down, there's going to be another platform that it is going to go to. And we see this happen with speech that is, or accounts that are taken down off Twitter, just move to Telegram. And then Telegram does absolutely nothing at all. And so this, the thinking more constructively about how to elevate better information is a worthwhile goal. Thinking about how to take the actually harmful content out of recommender systems, that's a worthwhile goal. How to create transparency so that people understand what's happening and where those decisions are made is a worthwhile goal. But I don't think that government has a role to play in content moderation adjudication.
Thank you very much. I'm just going back to one of your early slides where you had the propagation of information, newspaper, radio, television. Then you just had this sort of global internet. Do you not feel that you should insert smartphone in there? Because smartphone has really accelerated the dissemination of information and by extension empowered the influencers' influence.
No, I mean, that's definitely true. I know when I started accessing the internet, it was on a dial-up on a computer long before smartphones existed. But the subsequent slide, all of those icons are basically the app icons for the phone, right? It looks almost like a phone screen. So yeah, it is, I think it's that, and one of the big shifts that happens there is it goes from being something where I was kind of lucky to get my couple of hours of internet in. I do this with my kid now, or I'm 45 minutes, that's it. Where it becomes something that's with you 24/7, and and it becomes the place that you go. And that really does have a pretty profound shift. I mean, I see it even with my own kids, where I'm like, go outside, play with your friends, and he's like, well, I play with my friends on Fortnite. I'm like, all right, well, here we are. So it is. I think there are people who are trying to again recreate that sense of community where you're not on your phone all the time and your friends are back in the real world. But the phone also does address problems of loneliness and people feeling like they don't have connections in their community in some capacities. So I think it's a matter of finding some balance there.
Hello. I had a question about profit. We talk a lot about, you mentioned that government shouldn't be involved in content moderation. I'm curious what you think about how profit should be involved in content moderation, because it seems we're working at the behest of what is fundamentally a corporation whose goal is to derive profit from engagement, and there's profit to be made from the goal of misinformation. So you said that there should be no government role regulating content moderation. So I'm curious if your thoughts are that if social media companies should therefore be run as nonprofits to take any kind of profit out of the goal of public information.
Some people who are working on efforts like that, right? The idea of what does a public interest internet look like, or what does a public internet look like, or things like Mastodon, which are not operating under that same kind of ads-based business model. You know, there are efforts that are being made to do that. There's also people who are advocating for things like antitrust, right? Is another area that you see come up in social media. It's regulation. It's a little bit less prominent now, I think, in part because you are starting to see new entrants into the market being created. So the question is, what is the justification for the antitrust enforcement? I am not an antitrust expert, so I don't want to get over my skis on that. But you see people are asking this question because, again, the financial incentives, the business incentives of the platform are very much paramount. In Europe, where they have different views about government involvement in speech decisions, you're also seeing the creation of laws like the Digital Services Act that do have an enforcement capacity that allows them to fine platforms when particular content that they deem destabilizing in some way goes viral and the platforms don't act in response to take it down. This is a huge topic of conversation because there's a lot of concern also about how do you when you like the government, this seems like a good thing. If the government changes, does it still seem like a good thing? What do they ask for and when? So this is kind of one of these frontiers in global regulation of of the internet and the incorporation of government into these conversations. In the United States, I'll also add there was a Supreme Court case, the net choice cases, that was just kind of adjudicated over the summer. Platform curation is platform speech under US law. Like that's the current understanding. And so the platforms actually have an incredible amount of power to determine what they're going to curate and how they're going to moderate because it's seen as their expressive, it's an expressive action by the platform to determine what it's going to host and what it's going to amplify. So it's a very, very complicated topic of conversation. And one of the reasons why these public interest efforts are beginning is can you just create an alternate place and then are people drawn to it, which would then maybe mitigate some of the that feeling of the need to regulate the only 3 platforms in town.
Earlier, you spoke about how being true isn't enough in order to get information out and the challenges involved with that and the issues that you came across dealing with vaccines and that side of that discussion and that just having true information isn't enough and that people aren't willing to trust authority. So my question for you is, what should be the role of researchers, of academics, especially dealing with controversial topics in order to explore let's say their research topic is controversial, how should they be getting, or should they be getting their messages out on social media? Should they have a place on social media in order to convey their perspective and their knowledge? I guess how should they be approaching that given the way that different social media algorithms are structured?
I think the answer is that they should, as long as they're also aware of as long as they're doing it in almost like an informed consent kind of capacity, like these are the things that could go really, really wrong with that. Here's how you should be protecting yourself before you do it, particularly if you're going to engage on a highly controversial topic. I remember after the little vaccine law thing in 2015, where again, I was like an activist data scientist helping with that project. We were asked, the senator who led the bill, who was a pediatrician and a senator, the head of our group, Vaccinate California, and me were asked to give this lecture at the Berkeley School of Public Health about how we'd done it. And I got this question actually then 10 years ago from this public health student. And, and I'd just gone through the experience of being doxxed for the first time, being harassed, being followed, literally followed on the street in Sacramento. And she asked me, and I thought, like, God, no. Like, why the hell would anyone want to do that, right? Like, no, do your job. You're in public health. Like, your work is much more important. Don't waste your time on Twitter. But I feel like 10 years later, my answer is really different now, and it's because that void is unfillable. And it's not enough for the institutions to put out institutional tweets, right? It's not enough for the CDC to get on Twitter. And I mean, it is on Twitter. It's not very good at it, but it's there. But it is seeing, I think, the faces of the people conveying the information that makes that feel so compelling. You see this on TikTok all the time. Look at polling from a younger generation saying, well, I trust them, they're talking to me. I talked to Jeff Jarvis, who's a journalism professor, about this when I was writing the book, and he said something that stuck with me, which is, media talks to its audience, influencers talk with them. And that's where I think adopting that style of communication is very, very important. I mean, I rarely engage on Twitter at this point. I just don't see the point. I just don't see the value. But I am constantly on Threads, on Blue Sky, on Mastodon, writing, blogging. I mean, again, it's like, now it's my job, but it's also something that I think is actually very, very important because I want to have that channel of communication open. And the other thing that's very, very important about it is if people start to say things about your work that aren't true, you are the best messenger for getting that fact out there. Not everybody's going to believe you, but you have to at least have a channel to convey it in some way. And so I think that provided you take appropriate precautions to understand, like make sure your address isn't on the internet, there are ways that you can and should be doing it, because otherwise you're just sort of ceding the entire ground, and we're not having a discourse. We're just exiting the conversation entirely.
We have one more audience question, then I want to ask an ethics question.
I knew we are, oh, you're okay. I know we're past time, so if you want to close us out, Jenna, that would be great.
All right, and know that you can ask your question now.
Yes.
Here's an ethics question. This is another version that was submitted by a couple of people. I mean, you've gone through a lot, right? And what you've experienced is it's quite a story. And you only shared a piece of it here, but we all got a sense of the drama. And so here's the question: why we would all like to be as morally ethical as you have shown that you are in our dealings both with research and with people. Situations arise, right, that force us to choose sometimes. And how would you help us think about resisting the temptation to compromise on our ethics if it leaves us in a place where we can make what we see to be a positive contribution in the future?
Meaning, does the end justify the means?
Yes.
It's a tough one, and I don't think the answer is the same for every. I was just trying to think through, like, in politics, you're going for the win, which is why the end justifies the means so often, because there is that like one moment in contest, and so much is pushed aside in the interests of the one moment in contest. I think in research in particular, it's a long game, right? It's a building process. It's additive. It's your contribution to your field, and then your colleague contribution to your field, and so I feel like it would. I don't think the short-term gain is worth the long-term reputational delegitimization that would come from cutting corners. I'm trying to think of a specific situation. I don't know if they had one on the question.
Did not, but I like that answer, and I think we should close with that. Thank you very, very much for this. This has been very enlightening for all of us.
Yeah, thank you so much.